formal presentation, I want to introduce Neil Hamilton. The problem with doing this introduction is he's done so much of so much importance, it's sort of hard to choose what to pick. I sort of consider him the wise man, or maybe the George Clooney of agricultural law, in that lots of groupies around. He has been a professor at Drake Law School for slightly over 30 years. He established their Agricultural Law Center. He has taught legal seminars throughout the U.S. and in 22 foreign countries. He is currently acting as an advisor to Secretary of Agricultural Vilsack, and I can't even start to tell you the number of articles, books, all sorts of good stuff he's done. But I was absolutely delighted when he was willing to join us today. So I won't take any more of your time because we want to hear what he has to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jackie, and that was such a kind introduction. So I want to thank Professor Jackie Hand and Paul Thursam, and we should give them a round of applause, right? They were involved in putting this together, and for their hard work and vision in organizing this, and it's a real treat for me to be here, because other than driving through Detroit once, coming from Canada through Windsor, which was an unpleasant experience at a border crossing, as my wife happens to be foreign born. Now, we've never spent much time in the Detroit area other than the couple hours we were detained there, but that was on the other side of the bridge. But so it's a treat to be in Detroit, and looking forward to the tour and to learning more about what you're doing with urban agriculture. You know, my goal today is to share some insights with you and trying to put urban agriculture into a context of kind of the national agriculture and food discussion. And certainly, you know, again, want to commend you for what you're doing, because in any discussion about urban agriculture, Detroit's one of the cities, along with Cleveland, that certainly emerge. And I know a number of you in this room are very involved in that. Well, as you realize, of course, agriculture and farming is changing, has changed. We don't farm like my dad and my mom did on the farm that I grew up in southwest Iowa, kind of a quintessential family farm, hogs and cattle, corn and soybeans, big garden, chickens. We all go through changes in life, and some of them more puzzling than others. But, you know, for the last 15 years or so, I've been writing particularly about the role of food and the role of law as relates to our food system. And in this article that I wrote, I guess, 16 years ago now, called Tending the Seeds, the Emergence of a New Agriculture, wrote about a number of the developments that you could see emerging around the country, and even at that time, the whole question of community gardens and what we now think of as urban agriculture was part of that. And I've continued to write on that theme, and a series of articles on the theme of food democracy, because I think that in many ways what you see going on, as I'll talk a little bit more about, are really an expression of some democratic tendencies within our society. This is something, though, that my wife and I also do, because we have Sunstead Farm, have operated it's either a large garden or a small farm, and I guess from the USDA's census calculations, we're up in about the third category of farms as they count them, so it's more than a garden. And we sell vegetables to primarily local restaurants. We've been farmers market vendors. We also have a small CSA. And while we're, at least I would think, in the country, in many ways we're really also an urban farm, because we're in Dallas County, which is just to the west of Des Moines, and it happens to be the 8th fastest growing county in the state. The town of Waukee, or not in the state, in the nation. The town of Waukee, where we farm near by, had 1,200 people in 1980 and now has a population of 16,000. And has continued to grow as housing patterns and other things have moved towards the west of Des Moines. And so in many ways our customers have kind of come to us. Well, you know, as we think about where our food and agricultural system is, I think there are any number of forces that we can talk about, and some of these I'll refer to a little bit more. But just as a snapshot, I think you see the this increasing interest in farming. We're in many ways having a new surge of, I don't know whether you call it a back to the land or at least maybe a back to the vacant lot movement, and a new crop of farmers, recognition of food policy and food policy councils. Governor Vilsack, when he was the governor of our state, created the second state food policy council in the nation. We administered it through the law school. I chaired it for the 6 years that it was in existence, and we, with some funding from the USDA, helped create food policy councils in 15 other states, including some of the early work on the Michigan Food Policy Council. We also see certainly expanding forms of direct marketing, or in terms of terminology, something that I have taken to referring to as retail agriculture, which is a different and I think a broader way to talk about the topic. Certainly also see the consumer interest in better food. And, we've spent an awful lot of time and effort in our country with great success in making food cheaper. And there's certainly an important economic value in that. But I think we've also come to recognize that cheaper isn't necessarily always what motivates people. And in fact, many people are interested in better food. And better can be something that you fill in the blanks in terms of what that means to you as to the value that was involved. Our attention to urban agriculture and the opportunities that we've heard talked about this morning and we'll talk more about is another one of those major forces, as is the attention to childhood obesity and nutrition and school food and everything that's tied up in this whole debate about whether it's the First Lady's Let's Move campaign or the concerns about how, and it's certainly been in the news in the last several weeks in terms of projections about obesity and how we're in many ways kind of digging our graves with our teeth and planting very fertile seeds for a looming public health crisis in terms of the incidence of diabetes and other diet-borne illnesses, particularly among children. Another important trend, the whole issue of food artisans and businesses, looking at agriculture and food as a form of job creation and career building, and you had some reference to your cottage food law as an example of that. And also there are concerns about land ownership and land tenure. We'll be talking about land tenure today in primarily an urban environment. And all of those issues in some ways are related to urban agriculture. And this is something we're all connected to because we're only as far away from agriculture as our next meal, and the whole question of what we eat and where we choose to acquire it is these are decisions that are under our control. Urban agriculture, I want to talk about at least what I see as some of the key issues and how it relates to shaping our food system. First, I say I think that it is really part of this convergence of issues around health and community and sustainability, and urban agriculture is part of that because of its proximity to people. It also relates to the work that the Secretary and the USDA are doing in some ways, the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food campaign, the People's Garden Initiative, which he launched on Lincoln's 150th anniversary of his birth, and the Let's Move campaign in the White House, and as I mentioned here, and there's a reference to the to the food democracy issue, and a new article I wrote kind of looking at how this has progressed in recent years. The range of urban agricultural activity that you see going on in cities, both large and small, illustrates several things for us. I think that you see a great deal of energy, and certainly you folks are experiencing this to a great extent in Detroit in terms of the citizen engagement and energy around urban agriculture, and urban agriculture really being used as both an endpoint itself, but also as a device to achieve many of the other things, neighborhood improvement, food access, dealing with questions of food security, the type of issues that Ms. Duda referred to. And it also, I think another important thing to recognize about urban agriculture, and I believe this is certainly part of why people are excited that Detroit's civic leadership get on board, or at least try to put in place whatever it is you're going to need to try to facilitate it, is that urban agriculture can be an important and versatile tool to helping cities address some of the challenges they face. and certainly the situation you face with the amount of vacant land and the questions of how you stabilize and utilize the land that's in your city is part of that. And so from the standpoint of urban agriculture, I think another important thing to recognize is that urban agriculture has really been an important source of innovation. That the agriculture that I am embedded in many ways, kind of large-scale production agriculture is, and nobody talked about production agriculture when I was a kid. We were just farmers, right? We were involved in agriculture, and we're great at coming up with labels to try to distinguish ourselves from other folks. And so kind of big agriculture's label of the moment is calling themselves production agriculture. Well, the production agriculture that I grew up in, a farm of 200 acres of corn and soybeans that my family lived on for generations, now that farm's part of a neighbor's operation that this year he'll probably farm about 6,000 acres. A couple thousand that he owns, 3,000 or 4,000 that he rents from probably 25 other landowners, and then another 1,000 or 2 that he'll do as a custom farmer. And still as a family farm operation with his son and a couple hired men. And so while there's certainly change and innovation going on there, I don't think that it's necessarily the growing point of thinking differently about food production and connecting people to food that you might find in cities. And so that's why what you see going on in places across the country, from Cleveland to Kansas City to Minneapolis, to Detroit, as you folks are working through it now, is important to us in terms of helping identify new and better ways of thinking about food. Well, as it relates to the USDA, urban agriculture is, I say here, a two-sided issue, probably many more sides than that. On the one hand, it clearly relates to a number of the key priorities that the department's involved with, addressing childhood obesity and hunger, the delivery of food assistance programs like the SNAP program that takes up a large portion of the federal budget that's spent in food and agriculture, helping connect consumers with food, trying to support new farmers. These are all important issues. But at least from the USDA's traditional stance, where they would find themselves today, I think it challenges them both in its traditions, because it was never an urban organization, right? It was a farming-based organization, and as a result finds itself primarily oriented towards a very rural culture as opposed to an urban culture. And at the same time, it doesn't have a broad suite of programs, at least yet, that are specifically designed or tailored to an urban environment. And so in that regard, I think, and as we'll talk about when we look at some of the ideas that have been proposed in connection with the next Farm Bill, the question of how the USDA actually seizes urban agriculture. And one of the answers may be they probably won't call it urban agriculture. They'll probably refer to it as community agriculture, which is in many ways a better term, because the little town of 1,000 that I grew up near is a community, just like Detroit's a community. But Lenox, Iowa wouldn't think of itself as urban agriculture, right? But yet the whole issue of the community values that are involved in agriculture. But this issue of USDA's role is important. And just a side note for a moment as well, it hasn't received as much attention as I think it should or maybe could, but 2012 is a very important year in the history of American agriculture and of USDA, if you're interested in kind of anniversaries as being historical markers. And because it was in 1862, 150 years ago, in fact, two things happened 150 years ago this week, that the nation enacted took three of the actions that in many ways has shaped our history of agricultural development. The USDA was created as a federal agency. That happened on, I believe, the 15th of May. On May 20th, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. And also in 1862, the Morrill Act was passed, which created the land-grant university system, which created Michigan State, Iowa State, any number of other institutions. So if you think about those three things, creating a USDA, creating a Homestead Act that made available tens of million acres of land and helped seed hundreds of thousands of independent landowners, and then a land-grant university system which continued to this day to make available both public education but also innovation. Those are all important elements. And the ideas of the role of USDA, the role of land access, particularly land coming out of some type of public ownership, like you have now as you've reconsolidated land under things like your Wayne County Land Bank, as well as the issue of the role that universities can play. And I know that Michigan State, for example, has proposed an urban agriculture center for Detroit. Those three different components are still relevant today and relate to your issue of urban agriculture. Well, one of the subjects that I've been working on, in particular for the last year or two, or the two related subjects, are the efforts to promote and create new farms, as well as the expansion of direct marketing. I wrote a book about 12 years ago, I guess it is now, or maybe a little bit more, called The Legal Guide to Direct Farm Marketing, and which is in part funded by the USDA, and it's used as a legal resource for people who are involved in direct marketing. We're in the process now of rewriting that or editing it, and it's amazing to see the new approaches to direct marketing and really everything that's going on in the local food movement. And in your materials, the one item that you have that I suggested that our directors put there is this Congressional Research Service report on the role of local food systems in U.S. farm policy. And this most recent version is one from early April. And if nothing else, it gives you a very helpful compendium of the various USDA programs, whether grant programs or other programs that relate to local food, as well as a fairly thorough discussion of congressional action or ideas that have been proposed as relates to it. And it's, I think, an important report, if for no other reason than the fact that it was actually done, because it's not clear that 10 years ago you would have had the CRS doing anything dealing with something like local food. Well, as I also say here, I think one of the things that urban agriculture is doing, and it sounds like it's helping Detroit do it, is to help you reimagine the city and how they relate to food. And I did leave a typo in there that's across a range of public services as opposed to published services. And that's often a function of food policy councils, one of which you have here as well. And the whole issue of urban agriculture or community agriculture was part of a number of the pieces of legislation that were introduced in Congress this year as part of the run-up to the Farm Bill. Marcy Kaptur's bill, and the Congresswoman from Ohio, was an important piece of legislation. It encouraged the department to create a agency on community agriculture. The Food, Farm, and Jobs Act that Sherrod Brown and a number of other people introduced as a marker bill that included a number of what you might describe as these progressive ideas around local food. Only a number of the ideas from that bill were adopted, but they in part took the name because the Farm Bill that's now underway under works is also being called the Food and Jobs Bill, as we'll see in a moment. I do mention here one other development that's worthy to think about, and that is that to promote change or to make progress, it oftentimes doesn't necessarily require that you go back and come up with a new wheel or a new car. All you can do is go back and look at the tools you already had. And if you had to identify, I think, what the most effective thing that the USDA has done in the last several years to promote new and beginning farmers in the country and to promote direct farm marketing and its relation to local food, it's a program that you may or may not have heard of, but it's the NRCS, that's the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the former Soil Conservation Service. It's their High Tunnel program, or what their High Tunnel pilot program. And you all have an idea what a high tunnel looks like, basically a relatively inexpensive plastic greenhouse that may be 15, 20 feet wide and 100 feet long. And the NRCS has been funding the building or the construction of high tunnels as a conservation practice as a water-saving practice. In fact, they've funded 4,500 of these around the country in the last several years. 50% cost sharing. If you're a new and beginning farmer, socially a disadvantaged farmer, the cost sharing goes up to 90%. And so over 4,500 of these high tunnels built in the first 2 years as a pilot program, and now this has been made a national project or a national program under the EQIP program, using existing funding, existing language, and the NRCS high tunnel. I should have looked at the numbers, but I believe there have been at least 100 and some of them built in Michigan in the last year or two, and similarly in Iowa. And so that's the idea of creative utilization of these programs. Well, you know, Michigan, as you probably have heard, is uniquely positioned to try to influence the next farm bill. You have the chair of the Senate Ag Committee. I've worked in the past on several occasions with Tom Harkin, who is the senator from Iowa, who chaired the Senate Ag Committee during the 2 previous farm bills, and now is the chair of the Labor H Committee. And the Senate has passed their version of the bill, which we're going to turn to here in a moment, and so we'll talk about it. But there's another piece of legislation that was just dropped a couple weeks ago, and that's Representative Fudge from Cleveland has introduced the Let's Grow Act. And the Let's Grow Act is an interesting piece of legislation, 100 and some pages long, has about 20 different ideas, many of which relate uniquely to urban agriculture and local food. Well, as I say here, you know, the debate over the next farm bill is going to be divisive and long, and may ultimately be unsuccessful, at least depending on your perspective. I've believed for the last 2 years that it was going to be unlikely that we'd enact a 2012 farm bill, and given what's happened in the last couple days in terms of the increasing divisions between the House and Senate Ag committees, I think that's become even more likely. But let's assume for a moment that we do actually have a farm bill, and we're going to have one at some point. Whether they pass it this year as some form of extension because the current legislation expires at the end of September, or whether we come around to it next year after there's a new Congress, which you know, is a two-edged sword depending on your perspective and the programs you're looking at. There's at least the opportunity that it's going to, well, there's certainly the opportunity that it could do things as relate to urban agriculture and local food. The present bill, the one that made it through the Senate committee that's awaiting floor action in the Senate, which could happen by mid-June, has, you know, there's several things in it that are positive as relate to local food. It's certainly not a winner in that it doesn't have a local food or a community agriculture title. But a number of programs that were there were expanded. The Farmers Market Promotion Program, which was a $10 million grant round of grants to farmers markets, was expanded to $20 million a year, mandatory money. It was renamed the Farmers Market and Local Food Promotion Act, which changes the nature of the grants. USDA is directed to do an additional study on local food and local food marketing. There's an increase in the specialty crop grant funding, and this money is allocated to the states on a basis of a formula that's a function of the percent of agricultural production in the state of specialty crops. Michigan scores fairly highly, and it's a grant program. Then the money is used by the state departments of agriculture. In lots of states, these have been used for varying direct marketing and local promotion, urban agriculture type products. Not sure how Michigan's used a lot of its specialty crop money. And then there's also a $100 million project to create additional healthy option incentives in the use of the SNAP program, which is in part based on the Double Bucks project that Orrin Hesterman and the Fair Food group out of Michigan have pioneered, and or along with others as Wholesome Wave. And then there's also inclusion of the Healthy Food Financing title, which is a new line of funding coming out of Treasury using CDFIs to fund the creation of food access and food marketing facilities, primarily in food deserts or other impacted areas. And then there's also a doubling of funding for community grants, community food grants. And so there are a number of good ideas in there. There's certainly a number of things that aren't in there. There's no mandatory funding for the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. There's no funding for the Value Added Producer Grant Program, which rural development has used very effectively in rural areas, but USDA Rural Development's language and authority has also been amended to allow it to fund projects that otherwise might happen in what look like urbanized areas if they're designed to service producers who live in areas that are rural areas under their law. And if you're not familiar with the work of USDA Rural Development and you're a lawyer and you do any grant writing or working with producer organizations or communities, I'd encourage you to take a look at USDA Rural Development. It's a source of a significant amount of funding. In Iowa alone last year, rural development probably put close to $600 million worth of federal grants and financing on the street for rural housing, community facilities, and increasingly looking at ways to help individual producers. Well, I'm going to talk about a couple specific ideas before we wrap up, and one of them certainly is farmers markets and the whole growth in farmers markets. I was just on an American Bar Association webinar a week or two ago on counseling the local food movement. And as part of those materials, I included a report that I had done back in 2002 in which I looked at the rules of about 20 different farmers markets, identifying what you might describe as your typical regulatory approach to managing farmers markets. And at that time, the USDA inventory indicated there were about 2,500 farmers markets. And so here we are 10 years later, and the number of farmers markets has almost tripled. And it's not clear that USDA necessarily even captures most of the farmers markets. And so we're all going to have a chance to go to one here in a moment. You know, the great thing about farmers markets are that as I like to say, you know, people don't go to the farmer's market because the grocery stores are closed. You know, people go to the farmer's market because they want to. And we had 30,000 plus people in the opening day of the Des Moines Farmers Market on 2 Saturdays ago. 300 vendors. It's a huge economic driver. And I testified before the House Ag Committee back in May of 2010 when the D's were still in control and Chairman Peterson was handling the invitations, and spoke a little bit about local food and farmers markets. And you know, the USDA and Secretary Vilsack's Know Your Farmer program had come under some criticism by Senator McCain and Senators Chambliss and others who attacked it as being, you know, nothing but kind of helping affluent urban locavores, right, and kind of wannabe farmers. And as I told them that day, I said, you know, the tens of thousands of people that showed up at the Des Moines Farmers Markets wouldn't recognize the label affluent urban locavores, right? I mean, these were just hard-working folks that go to the farmers market when it opens because they have a chance to reconnect with farmers and get local, get fresh food and support their community. And if you look at a farmer's market and you only see the urban setting or the setting where the market happens, you're only seeing one end of it. Because as I suggested to the committee that day, you really need to follow the pickup trucks back home to the Mingos and La Villas and the little towns and watch the people counting the money on the table, at least whatever of it gets home, because a fair amount of it may get spent on the way going home. But farmers markets are a very effective form of rural economic development. And so that's one of the reasons why we're part of them. You may be familiar with the Buy Fresh, Buy Local campaign. Through the Agricultural Law Center at Drake, we're the sponsors of Buy Fresh, Buy Local for the greater Des Moines area. This is our new 2012-2013 directory with the 80 farmers and the dozens of markets, and just came off the press a week or so ago. And you know, farmers markets are an important part of this system, but they're only one of the forms of direct marketing. You've, I think, have seen an interesting growth in community-supported agriculture, kind of this proliferation of approaches towards retail agriculture, and a real evolution in CSAs in terms of the length of the seasons, the mix of the products, the fact that you've got multiple producers involved, all of which may raise some interesting legal questions for the lawyers in the audience. New interest in farmers, America's New Agrarians. I mentioned this to you before. I have an article that just came out in the Fordham Law Review on this subject. here's a couple pictures from UC Santa Cruz at the student farm. One of the challenges that the nation faces with a lot of people who are interested in farming or in urban agriculture is that they may not have come from an agricultural background. And so there's the question about where is it that you get the training and experience and the opportunity to learn how to do it. Well, UC Santa Cruz is one of the few universities in the nation that has a residential on-farm training program. They have about 45 interns who are paying tuition, or at least it's an interesting affair. They're not paying tuition to the university, they're paying tuition to University Extension Service. They spend 6 months in training working on this farm, receive a certificate, and in fact, the woman next to me in the black t-shirt, this is out in Santa Cruz, California. I met her. She's from western Iowa. Spent 20 years working for a business in Omaha and wanted to come back to her family's farm in Logan, Iowa, be a direct marketer, sell food into the Omaha farmers markets, and had to go to California to find a program that really gave her the training experience to be able to do that. But she's one of our newest farmers in Iowa. Here's a picture of the secretary talking about new farmers. And, we have a history in our nation of seeking people to put their hands in the soil and be part of farming and agriculture. It comes at various times to serve various needs that the nation's facing. After the president was elected, and I had the pleasure of being the chair of the Rural and Ag Committee for his campaign in Iowa, and Iowa at least played a little bit of a role, as you might remember, in his election, because that was when he won the Iowa caucuses. But after he was elected, I had this op-ed in the Register about launching a new farmer corps, looking at the issue of public service as relates to agriculture. And the next summer, organized a meeting along with the Farm Credit System in D.C. and pulled together a number of people that are involved in public service and agriculture. And we didn't come up with a new farmer corps, but what did emerge is the food corps. And the food corps now is a pilot program funded by the National Corporation for Public Service. We have 50 food corps volunteers who are just completing their first year of service. We had 10 pilot states that we've put food corps members into. They're working with schools to help implement school gardens and school-based nutrition programs. We hope to expand to 100 corps members and expand to 13 or 14 states in this next year. But it's a good program if you have an opportunity. And what's interesting about it, when we first advertised for food corps members, we had 1,250 applicants for these 50 positions, and an amazing group of people. I was just with all of the food corps members at the end of April when we brought them together in D.C. for a couple days. Well, you know the role that food plays as a form of economic development, and urban agriculture is certainly part of that, and you're familiar with what's going on in various cities and the type of opportunities that it introduces. I gave a talk in Brooklyn in November of 2010 at a conference that was sponsored by, it was called the Black Farmer and Urban Gardener Conference. And they had over 400 people show up at college for a Saturday, interested in learning more about how they could be part of the food system. And so, in conclusion, there's a number of things that people need to do. Certainly the USDA needs to figure out a way to engage with urban agriculture and community agriculture, other than the kind of episodic ways that it does it now through Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food. And one of the values of that would be that a lot of the support and funding for urban agricultural activities isn't necessarily going to come out of USDA. It's going to come out of HUD, it's going to come out of Health and Human Services for refugee retraining, it's going to come out of VA as you work with America's veterans, out of the CDC as we deal with health issues. But somebody needs to coordinate those cross-agency or cross-department programs as relates to agriculture. We also have the use of innovative programs and how those can be expanded into urban areas. Even though you don't think about USDA having much of a footprint in urban areas, there isn't anything that restricts its activities here, other than that some of the programs like rural development that may have a rural definition tied to who their people can be. But otherwise, the NRCS and dealing with conservation and water issues and soil issues can work anywhere in the nation. Expanding access and the use of nutrition programs, the double voucher initiative, expanding the use of SNAP, expanding the availability of EBT, right? I mean, as we moved to EBT and came up with a paperless system of food stamps and public food assistance, it also created a real challenge for episodic marketing opportunities, such as you have at farmers markets and even roadside stands, to have access to the technology. Some states have dealt with it through their own funding. Iowa has an extensive program and has EBT available in most of the farmers markets in the state. And this is one of those places where the continuing evolution of technology, the fact that you can get a little gizmo and put on your cell phone and run a credit card through it, increases the opportunities to make available programs like this. Now, clearly the delivery of a public benefit, such as SNAP, and being able to deliver it through some type of control system and have access to the public database so that you can debit people's accounts raises challenges. But until we do that, you have the anomaly of farmers markets basically having to remonetize food stamps. And so people come, swipe their card at the farmers market, they give them tokens or coupons, they're given to the vendors come back, cash them back out with the market. And, it's a circular process. There's a much better and cleaner way to do it. And it's one of the things that Congress and the department can help do. And so here, for example, with the Reinhardt girls, of course, one of the successes to having a family farm is, I guess there's several. One's having a job that has health insurance, and then the other one's having lots of kids. And the Reinhardts, I think, have 7 kids that have helped them over the years as they've expanded their farm. But they're using the new EBT machine the first year we had them at the market in Des Moines. Well, Congress can do several of these things. And even though, local agriculture hasn't been a major focus of this fight, and the Farm Bill discussions always devolve into these very interesting discussions. And this year's the whole issue of crop insurance, and crop insurance as a substitute for direct payments. And now we've got this regional and commodity divide going on over whether or not, the safety net is safe enough, which translates largely to whether or not you or I as the public are going to subsidize agricultural enough to satisfy them. And while much of the attention hasn't necessarily been on the issues that are in the Chapter bill and the Fudge bill, I think there may be an opportunity, particularly if both the House and Senate pass versions and they have to be reconciled. Part of the reconciliation is also going to be the effort to search for the votes that it's going to take on the floor to pass these things. And agriculture is not going to be able to pass a major and relatively expensive farm bill, even though they may have jobs and food in the title, unless there are things in it that, in fact, urban or non-agricultural representatives in Congress want and support. And so there's still that opportunity in this process for things to happen. Well, there's certainly things that communities can do, empowering people, old and young, who want to farm. That's one of the things that Detroit is certainly trying to do. Taking advantage of programs like the Food Corps, using food policy councils, as you have one. That's almost 10 years ago, we put on a national forum on state and local food policy councils at Drake and put together this toolbox for people to use. There's also an expanding role for city leaders. And back in April, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which now has a food policy task force, met for a couple days. And, historically, the mayors wouldn't have had much stature or involvement in discussions about food policy or the Farm Bill. But that's beginning to change as you have an increasing number of cities like Detroit that have food policy councils, and mayors and city governments recognizing that there's a lot that Congress and federal policy does that shapes what they're doing. And certainly that's something that you need to examine and see what Detroit's role is. As you realize, Detroit gets an awful lot of attention when it comes to urban agriculture. You were the focus of the ABA article from August of last year, plowing it over. All you have to do is look in your newspapers to see things about urban agriculture. I'm encouraged after hearing from and meeting some of you that you're going to find your way to a future. Get yourself out of this puzzling situation with your right to farm law, because I can tell you you're the only city and state in the nation that has somehow encountered in right to farm laws as an obstacle to promoting urban agriculture. And so I encourage you to find your way through to that. And then finally end with a little bit about the President and the White House. Their support for this is important. The First Lady's garden at the White House and her efforts on Let's Move, even though she's talking more about moving and less about food now as we move into a political year, but that might change in a second term. I mean, this has been, I think, very important in terms of elevating the discussion about food. This is a picture, one of my favorite pictures. I took this, it was in first week of August in 2007. It was in a backyard of a farm in Adel, Iowa, maybe about 8 miles from where my wife and I farm now. And it was a day that maybe will live in infamy with some people, because it was when the president, now president, then candidate, senator, was talking about food, and he asked the crowd, he says, well, have you been into Whole Foods lately and priced arugula? And oh my God, there was this gasp that kind of went through the political advisors and the press corps, because we don't have a Whole Foods in Iowa, at least didn't yet. One's going to open this summer, just like you're going to have one soon. And arugula wasn't maybe the best chosen term. And some of you are old enough to remember Michael Dukakis and his kerfuffle over endive with Bill Clinton back in the 1990s in an earlier campaign in Iowa. But my view of that is that a lot of people know arugula in Iowa. Hundreds of people raise it. We plant a lot of it, sell it to many people. And as I tell folks, I said, part of our challenge is helping the president seize his inner arugula and helping the nation think about what it is that we eat and our diets and how we can go about it. And so that's why the White House garden, and this is Sam Cass, the first couple's chef, who's also the White House advisor on food policy, and when we were visiting the White House garden a month or so ago. And that garden is, I used to be the chair of the National Gardening Association, the organization. Whenever you see things that talk about how many million people have backyard gardens, and it's always a survey put out by the National Gardening Association, well, that's the organization. I think you can argue that that garden at the White House is one of the more powerful gardens in the nation, because of how it helps influence our thinking about food and helps us realize the importance of putting our hands in the soil, as you're trying to do here. And so I always like to end with this, two pictures. Here's my favorite farmer, that's my wife, and some of our heirloom tomatoes. Just before I got on the plane to come out here, I was still putting up cattle panels, so that now we have 600 tomato plants out, and there's still dozens of trays in the greenhouse. I'm either have to go buy more cattle panels or somehow throw the rest of the tomato plants away. We raise about 70 different varieties of tomatoes a year on our farm. I'm also on the board of Seed Savers Exchange, which is an heirloom vegetable organization some of you may know about. And then the final pictures, little girls and kitties. It always brings a smile. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here in Detroit, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions.
I have a question about, obviously you're very in touch or have your fingers on the pulse of what's going on at the federal level in the government.
A little bit.
And what I didn't hear, and I'm just curious if you hear anything about it, is the effect of more local, / more urban agriculture in food security.
Well, I guess my answer would be certainly a lot of people talk about it as a form of food security, and even our first speaker, it's interesting to know how much food Detroit could raise if it wanted to. But, and there's, any additional food that people produce out of the backyard garden or the community garden or that you sell at the Eastern market is a good thing, right? If it makes money for the people who raise it, if the people who buy it, right, made a choice to get it. I don't think that our motivation is, oh my gosh, we need to feed Detroit out of Detroit. right? This isn't the Victory Garden situation, and it isn't the Cuban situation. You know, I've been in Cuba 3 times in the last year. I took a group of agricultural law students to Cuba in January for a week to look at agricultural land reforms that they're going through. And of course, a lot of people think about Cuba and the role of Cuba and all of the urban agriculture. And a lot of that was driven by the necessity of when the Soviet Union collapsed and they lost a large part of their food supply. And the fact that they have increased the amount of food they can produce, it's a good story for them. But it's not necessarily a motivation for us, right? I mean, we've raised 40% of our fruits and vegetables out of our backyards during the Second World War. But we don't need to go to another war, right, to be able to figure out that we can raise food. Now, there are other reasons why it can be a motivator. And certainly food security is a piece of it. But I think it's down the road on the issue of food security.
Is there not even a connection between that and energy security, just considering the price of gas and how our current, majority of our production is dependent on?
Yeah.
Fuel
Well,
costs.
certainly, agriculture is energy intensive, relatively energy intensive wherever you would do it. Having to ship a lot of stuff around the country, right, adds to the cost. From a food security standpoint, it probably more adds to its vulnerability because there are only a handful of railroad bridges that cross the Mississippi. And if those go down, the ability to move produce from the western part of the United States to the eastern part goes away very quickly. Anybody that's been on the Zephyr waiting to cross the bridge at Burlington to go west on Amtrak, realizes the bottleneck that can happen there with freight shipping. Part of the problem with making the food security or the energy arguments is that there's always somebody that'll counter it, because you'll see people writing, oh my God, local food's so much more energy intensive, right? Or it takes so much more energy because we could ship 1 semi-load of lettuce from California, and instead you've got 20 guys driving pickup trucks back and forth, and look at all the energy that took. And okay, well, not very many of us think necessarily about the amount of energy. And it's not that it's an idle concern, but it's not sure that it would influence which lettuce you bought, right? Now, certainly England's looked at the whole issue of carbon labeling, right, and food miles, and those questions, and it's a legitimate issue, but I'm not sure that it's a significant one that drives people's food choices. Certainly, it's something that should be in the equation, but there are a whole lot of externalities that we don't put into the equation, or that aren't kind of fractured out for us, right, or fractioned out for us to see it. If you had if when you saw the price tag on a loaf of bread and you saw the amount that was in the package and the amount that went to the driver and the labor and how little of it went to the farmer, that's one of the reasons why I think the idea of retail agriculture as a concept is important. I grew up in a farm household where my dad was always cussing about cheap food and America's cheap food policy, and by God, if the farmer could just get a little more slice of that consumer dollar, right? And that whole question of how you were going to get more of that slice. Well, in the time since he was a farmer, the average slice has continued to decline. Though it differs depending on the commodity. If you produce milk, you're getting a bigger slice of the pie than you might be if you're producing grain. But that's if you're locked into a commodity system and what you're selling is an ingredient, right, as opposed to selling a product. One of the things I tell people is that there are 2 major differences between the way my wife and I farm in our experience and what my mom and dad did. And that's even to call us farmers, but for the sake of this, let's call us farmers. In the 50 years that they farmed, there was never once that they ever went someplace and set the price for what they sold, right? You take a load of corn to town, there's the price on the chalkboard. $2.35 today. If you don't like it, take it home, right? You take the cattle to the auction barn, or you have the order merchant come out and look at them. This is what fat cattle are going for today. People come to our farmer's market, or restaurants call up and say, okay, we want 20 pounds of spring garlic. One of the things we have to figure, well, what the hell do you think we ought to charge for it? Right? I mean, what do you think we can charge this year? And maybe it's a calculation of what do we have into it, but it's also a calculation and part of the market. And it's not unlimited, but it's also, right, we set the price. But even more important than that, I think, is that in those 50 years of them farming, there was probably never once that anybody ever came back to them and said, you know, Ham and Zell, you know, thanks so much for raising that. Oh, that was so good. Well, nobody eats corn that way. Nobody eats soybeans that way. And even when they raised hogs and cattle, nobody ate it as their hogs and cattle because they didn't sell it to anybody, right? They sold it to somebody else, right? And then you bought the steak somewhere else. And so there was never that connection. And I think that they lost a couple things. One, they certainly lost the connection we have. We go into a restaurant and there's our name, Hamilton Sunstead Farm on the menu, or we have people come back and say, oh my God, those were the best baby beets we've ever eaten, and how you told us to fix them. There's a real, both a psychic satisfaction and arguably a financial one as well. But also the fact that they never had anybody come back and thank them, I think helps create a situation where farmers and producers are disconnected from, right, consumers. And that's why you have this, I think, amazing situation in America where the farmers and the consumers are kind of at loggerheads, right? That the farm community has seen the growth of consumer movements as a threat. Well, these are your customers, right? It's a production equation. You produce it, you sell it to somebody, right? The better it is for them, or the more it is value to them, the more you get for it. So how is it that you see your customers as your enemy, right? So that's how you end up with bumper stickers that say, you know, shut up, or don't complain with your mouth full, right? Or basically shut up and eat it. And part of what you have, I think, going on in the direct food movement or retail agriculture, however you want to, right, characterize it, is both more connection between eaters and producers, or turning them into one and the same, as well as more opportunity for communication, for knowledge, for informed choices. These are the type of things I talk about in the food democracy theory. But anyway, I'll shut up. That's a long answer. You didn't want a second speech. Somebody else had a hand up before Jackie says we need to clear the room. Yes, Greg.
Two things. You mentioned commodity, your community supported agriculture, and I think that's sort of a subscription model.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it relates to that or not, but seeing as at least a certain segment of society is not really found in the corporate model, how do you think cooperatives fit in if they still do it?
Yeah.
Into urban agriculture, and, you know, just generally.
Yeah.
That's a sort of more consumerism model.
That cooperatives are? Well, I think maybe as you've seen them in food, they might be, because the typical buying club, right, is organized really in a cooperative format. And the difference between a buying club and a CSA is a CSA would be, I own it as the farmer, right? I'm selling you shares, and part of the premise is we're in a community and it's a risk mitigating technique because I use you to finance it and pre-sell this stuff. Whereas if you were in a buying club, part of your driver would be, well, you know, we can get that for less. You know, we can get eggs from her for less than we're getting them from Old Ham, right? And which it makes sense because you're trying to get things more efficiently. Now back to cooperatives. And one of the first classes I taught when I began teaching at the University of Arkansas was on agricultural cooperatives. You know, and cooperatives are a powerful form of business model. And in agriculture, they've been very important in terms of marketing and input supply. Much less existence of cooperatives in any type of joint production method. Certainly have some in a marketing sense. But to have a marketing cooperative, all you need to do is say we're together as a marketing co-op, you know, and that gives us antitrust protection for purposes of price bargaining. You know, I mentioned Cuba earlier. A lot of their development is based around kind of cooperative models, but that's in part because they're coming out of either a state-owned land system or the land, you know, being distributed from the state, not to individual private owners, but to some form of intermediary, like a cooperative. And, you know, there may be opportunities for a cooperative type approach, but we certainly don't have much, you know, we don't have much history of any type of cooperative land ownership. We don't even share machinery very well. I mean, you go out in the countryside, you know, every farmer's got a $300,000 or $400,000 combine, or maybe a couple of them, and if they're lucky, they use them a week of the year, right? Now, their view is, well, I need it the week I need it. You know, as opposed to, well, maybe I could use yours the next week, right? Or maybe all of us don't need to have a combine. And I think within urban agriculture, that's one of the models that you're going to see with larger scale community farms or community gardens or incubator type farms, is you have more of an opportunity to share expenses, share equipment, share technology, right? I mean, one of the projects we're working on now really deals with land access, and it's talking to what you might describe as non-traditional landowners, like churches, land trusts, and developers. You've got developers that own lots of land in the urban edge, some of which may be developed relatively soon, some of which probably isn't going to be developed for 10 or 15 years. Well, why can't you have a model of having people be able to use those farms for local food production during the period of time that the developer doesn't need them? Because in that standpoint, a farm that you go to at the farmer's market, most of you've never been to the farm. You don't know where it is. You assume there is one, but the fact that it moved a mile down the road next year wouldn't change it, right? What the farm has is the quality of its products and its relationship to you. Its major asset isn't necessarily the land that it's on. And one of the challenges with new and beginning farmers, if you start with the premise that, well, geez, the first thing you gotta do is take a whole bunch of money and tie it up in a bunch of land so you have access to it, and then your capital strapped to be able to do anything else, why don't we reverse that and say, well, is there some way we can figure out farming on somebody else's land, right? And then, paying rent or whatever I need to do to have access to it. And so I think there are some opportunities there for a cooperative type model. Yes, Jackie.
You mentioned earlier that there is a cooperative of the small producers called Nathan that I believe they're only cooperating on marketing. They have a section that you can count on in the Eastern Market where every week that's where those folks are.
We'll make sure we go and talk to them.
And there's a really funny, a young woman who's raising ducks has played off of that at her operation, which is, I think, very small, maybe 10 ducks, but it's late in Detroit.
Late in Detroit, okay. Well, any other questions or comments? One over here.
There's a disconnect for the medium to small producer. In Michigan, we call livestock farms. If it's 50 animals or less, it's a small farm. To get that to a USDA inspected plant and then wrapped and back for retail at a farmer's market, sometimes it's 400 miles back and forth. If you are...
It'd be unlikely, but do you have state inspected plants in
No,
Michigan?
we don't.
Oh, well,
And
there's
so
one of your
I was
problems.
wondering if there's any national movement to improve access to the USDA. Because those plants don't give you back your own animal. You can...
Well...
in this state, like if right here we have a plant in Detroit for sheep, but they don't work with the small farmer.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things. Some states have state inspected plants. And if you have state inspected plants and you're not selling across state lines, that can be sold legally. And so that's one of the things we have an eye on, the state inspected plant. And the federal law has been amended to allow interstate shipment of state inspected meat as long as the states have qualified for federal. The other exception, certainly have the whole issue of mobile slaughter facilities. And I've toured mobile slaughter facilities, and I tell you what, it sounds a lot easier in concept than it does to physically visible, because there's a lot that's involved turning a live steer into steaks, and to do it all in the size of something that's like a semi-truck trailer, there's a lot going on. But there are examples of them. The Glenwood Center out of the Hudson Valley in Cold Springs has funded one in the Hudson Valley as a kind of an experiment. And the USDA's put in some funding through rural development into mobile slaughter. And mobile slaughter is a little easier for chickens. Larger animals is tough. Again, does Michigan have local lockers that are either federal or state inspected? But you have a freezer beef exemption in which you can sell animals not by the retail pound, but instead by a section. So you can pre-sell quarters, halves, eighths.
You can do that if you find the consumer ahead of time and they buy the whole animal. You get 4 buyers of an animal, and then it can go to it.
Yeah, well, that's not, that's an expanding, we've got, I think, 25% of the cattle producers in Iowa have some form of a freezer beef trade.
Right.
And it's, you know, it's a fairly remunerative, and you have to comply with the state law, you know, the fiction is that you own a portion of the animal, and then you're paying for a portion of the processing charges, and the only problem with using that approach is then immediately the raw milk folks like to seize on that, you know, to try to cover the sham of a herd share program. But I guess the other thing to do would be, if you're going to see growth in small-scale livestock production, at some point somebody's going to look at it and say, you know, I think there's a business opportunity there to have a small-scale, multi-species, federally inspected plant. And it, you know, this stuff's only going to work if, in fact, there's a commercial market for it at the end of the day. Because if the sustainability plan for any of these ventures is the next time we can get a grant to keep our doors open, whether it's an incubator, you know, farm or a garden or a farming operation, it's not a sustainable system. And part of what I think you see, and it's exciting around kind of food artisans and the entrepreneurship and the interest of people in farming is people are, you know, they're betting, you know, they're betting the farm. They're putting their money at risk and looking for these type of ventures. And from a legal standpoint, part of the challenge is making sure that we aren't throwing up unrealistic hurdles or barriers to them being able to succeed in doing that. But that's just my bio. So anyway, thanks a lot.